I think that we need to produce a commercial. We're all allies. Colonialism didn't just happen to Indigenous people. It happened to Irish people. It happened to African people. And they pulled the same shit on everybody. So it's like, you know, the church sent over the Irish nuns and priests that they raised in their residential schools in Ireland, and then abused them, and then they came over here and they ran the residential schools here. And so if you look at history of oppression, so if we all get together and organize, we're all going to be affected by this new legislation. So if we had, like they do in the States, we need in-your-face commercials in the media. We need to educate people. And if people are sitting in front of their TV set, we need to talk to Joe and Mary Smith that are sitting in front of their TV set and say, this could be you. Have one too many drinks, drive your car home from the PTA meeting, and you could end up in jail with a minimum sentence.
Yeah. Also, in terms of opposition to this bill, there's even a Supreme Court judge who's spoken out against it. Like, that's very unusual for a judge to actually come out that way, but they have. And even though it's going to go through, I think we need to make it obvious that there was no mandate behind this. So go, when you're Googling, go to Lead Now, Stop the Crime Bill. They have organized a bit of a way that you can express yourself through letters to your MPs. And I do think it's really important that there is a record of the opposition that is occurring around this. I see that there are 3 more questions. We're going to take them, and then I'm going to ask Wanda to come back up.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Amanda, and I'm a graduate student at OISE, and my work focuses on how schools as an institution collude with jails to create an expectation of incarceration for Aboriginals and also other racialized groups. My question is, looking at the bill, and unfortunately, sadly, it looks like it is going to pass. We all know that there's widespread resistance to this bill. Like you said, there's judges speaking out against it, there's grassroots organizations, and that the consequences are going to be devastating. One thing that gives me hope is that, okay, the Conservatives cannot be in power forever. So what does that look like? What does it look like in terms of resistance after this bill is passed, so that it's not inevitable that we go down the same path as the US? And what does it, legally, what does reversing this legislation look like once the Conservatives lose their majority?
Okay, well, I'm going to discuss that because it does have some interesting parallels to the sex work criminalization. The Communicate law came in under conservative government, and we see that linked directly to the number of deaths of Aboriginal women and the pig farm. The pig farm pretty much may not have happened at all if we did not have the Communicate for the purposes of prostitution law. So how do you get through that? Well, we're going to the Supreme Court. Parliament of Canada has sat twice, traveled across this country twice to talk about sex work. During Pierre Trudeau, we had the largest study of sex work in the world happen here. And then Brian Mulroney came into power, and he took the results from that and created the Communicate bill and didn't remove the Body House law. So if we want to get rid of this, we need to have people in Parliament who are willing to remove it, or you need to have lots of money to go continually to the Supreme Court.
It's like any legislation that gets put into place, right? And the damage that is done years after. I just had a conversation earlier today where we talked about something that was put into place in Ontario, not on a federal level, by the Harris government, and how our legislation and law and people are still adversely affected by it. So it's years. So even if you ask a question, a hypothetical question, what does it look like when the Conservatives are no longer in power? Well, the watershed in the criminal code around sentencing that occurred, the 718(2)E, we're still fighting about what glad do principles are at Supreme Court levels. and how they apply to different people, like long-term offenders. And, you know, those laws changed almost 12 years ago now. And so the fact that it takes law, once it's put into place, it takes a little while for it to have that effect to start with. And then it takes always just as long or longer to get rid of it. And I mean, the most relevant example I can think of is the Indian Act. 136 years, you can't just pull it away with no support or systems. What's going to happen? And nobody can come to a good solution about it. So this omnibus is that big. It's so big. It involves the 9 different bills and numbers of legislation that it will have an impact well beyond even if it's revoked with the new government. And it will take time because all of the parts that will have to be repealed unless it's done like another omnibus. And like, how do you catch all of the things, right? So it's going to have lasting impacts. And it will be a long, hard fight for various constitutional challenges to the Supreme Court of Canada. So.
Yes, my name is Michael, and I just have one question. What about the wrongfully convicted, like Donald Marshall, people like that?
Yeah. Do you want me to attack this one? Presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence is a fundamental justice belief that we hold in Canada. Okay, and the legislations that are coming into place, and already legislation that was passed during the last government sitting, one bill I can think of called the Truth in Sentencing Act, is already having an adverse effect, because what it's saying is they'll only, if you don't get released on bail, the time they count while you're in what's known as dead time is 1 day, and if a judge wants to deviate from that, he or she has to explain in writing why they're going to allow 1.5 days. And then that's calculated. So, okay, if you're not released on bail and you're held in custody, you already have a record of if you're then found convicted, you already have done time served or now have a jail record. Okay, so that's one example. And it seems to just smack or slap in the face of those fundamental justice principles such as innocence until proven guilty. And a number of the portions of this bill getting tougher on crime presumes that people are criminal. It slaps in the face of the fundamental principles of justice, and one of the biggest ones in Canada being the presumption of innocence. So yeah, it's going to have an adverse effect, and it's changing the way people, in law at least, are going to have to act in order to maintain that presumption as a fundamental principle. So in relation to the wrongfully convicted, though, right, is someone's wrongfully convicted, like Donald Marshall, the presumption of innocence, if that's at risk, imagine what happens to people who are wrongfully convicted, who do that time, who have stricter sentences, longer periods of mandatory minimum, and at the end of the day, it turns out that they're wrongfully convicted. Well, we see wrongful conviction because that fundamental principle of the presumption of innocence isn't working properly. And it's only going to get worse now. That's my point when I talk about the presumption of innocence and when you talk about wrongfully convicted people. There's a harm already been done to a person if they're wrongfully convicted. But when you talk about Aboriginal people, particularly someone like Donald Marshall, it was because he was Aboriginal. And so Aboriginal people and populations, that's that criminalization, they're going to be at even higher risk now.
Hello, my name is Emily, and I'm studying alternative justice models, and I was just wondering if in the restorative justice practices or the sentencing circles, is there any space for reflection on racial profiling and on racism, systemic racism? Like, is there potential in alternative systems to address this racism and this history?
No. And the short answer is no, but the longer answer, and Audrey's already touched on this too, is sentencing circles that we see within the Canadian justice system are usually sanctioned by the Canadian justice system. So they're not actually in Anishinaabe is called Ganok Nagawan, the Constitution, the laws of our people. It's not actually Indigenous justice. There are certain groups that had sentencing circles of sorts. But for instance, when you look into Saskatchewan, it's a judge-sanctioned model. When you look in Ontario in some places, it's a judge or criminal court sanctioned. A number of you will remember Yellow Quill a couple years ago. A very young dad in a drunken stupor let his 2 infant or toddler children freeze to death. And all you saw in the media, all you saw splashed everywhere was the injustice that was being done because he was going to be allowed to have a sentencing circle. But like 3 of the articles actually touched on the fact that the community was going to have a sentencing circle, but at the end of the day, it was the judge who was going to decide the sentence. No one touched on the fact that having that sentencing circle would have brought that community some important opportunity to discuss the problems, not just of that one incident, but the problems within their community. So do those circles, do they help Aboriginal communities and people? Absolutely. Are they important? Yes, but it must be noted that things sanctioned by the Canadian justice system are separate from actual Indigenous justice. And so when those newspaper articles came out, no one said, oh, by the way, the judge gets to determine the sentence. Everyone was just mad that how dare we were going to let these people get together and talk about a real live issue in their community and make a recommendation about a sentence. And by the way, the judge didn't follow their recommendations. He used his judicial discretion and the Canadian law in place to make his sentence.
As an Aboriginal youth court worker and working out of a Gladue court as a Native court worker, the battle happens in the courthouse. They don't just hand over the decisions. I would have to go to the Crown's office, the head Crown, and sit there and basically sell him on why they should give Native diversion to my client. And it's not just something that's automatic.
Okay, thank you very much for all the amazing information. I feel like we're living in really scary times. There's definitely a war being fought at home on Indigenous people. We have a government that's gearing up to sign a mutual defense agreement with Israel, which will take us straight to war potentially with Iran, if Israel chooses to go forward with that. How good that we have so many strong, committed women, like these ones sitting on the panel. I really want to thank you again, Krista, Morgan, and Jules, for coming out despite your illness especially.